Zapre las lo mir allegein. Oi, 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 das oi, jet wieder mit Glück tanzen der Zapre las sing jet in der Oi, das oi, jet wieder mit Glück tanzen der Zapre las lo mir allegein.
Many of you probably know, Yiddish was obviously, it was the secular language of the street basically for about a millennia for Jews in Eastern and Central Europe. It's written in the Hebrew alphabet from right to left, but it is mostly considered Germanic in its grammatical structure, although there's still some debate on that front. It was spoken by about 11 million or 13 million people at the time of World War II, and largely due to the Holocaust and the subsequent basically division of the diaspora basically to Israel or to North America, where they got assimilated into English or were, their kids were raised in Hebrew in Israel. It's largely fallen out of use as an everyday language within any communities except within the religious Jewish community in which it's used today. So we're here to talk today about where it goes from here.
The title is Yiddish Dead? I prefer to call it a discussion on the relevance of Yiddish in the 21st century. And I'm assuming a lot of you are here because you have some kind of a connection to the language. Others just might be. Is there relevance for Yiddish today? I mean, the language by and large doesn't really have a practical use outside of the Hasidic community, which basically uses it to stay apart from the rest of the world. So why would it be of any usefulness to maintain the language alive and to pass it on to our children? Stephanie, would you like to field that?
Sure, on the spot. I think for me, the importance of why we need to preserve it has a few different layers, so I'll try to go through each one. On a personal level, growing up in Yiddish theater, literally in my mom's belly, in 1978, my mom was dancing on stage with me, a month from being born. So it is in my blood, for sure, as Brana was talking about. And so I think even just in elementary school and in high school, going to JPBS, going to Bialik, I had this personal crusade of trying to show all my friends, hey, Yiddish is cool. Yiddish has cool songs and there's cool rituals, and there's a history and a culture that surrounds it that goes beyond just learning about Gittel and Muttel and they went to school. Yiddish valedictorian speech, I was like, you know what? I'm not just going to be the one where everyone falls asleep. I'm going to make this into a theatrical moment for myself to show people, you can make jokes in Yiddish that people are going to appreciate and laugh at too. So that's a very personal connection for me. But I think also when you look at just the broader culture of living in a French majority community, I find that there are a lot of ties within Yiddish culture and the French community as well. And I actually discovered this a lot. I was doing TV production in my undergrad, and I did a documentary on the Yiddish Theatre of Montreal and their links to the greater French community. And I had the opportunity to interview Michel Tremblay. We had done an adaptation of Les Belles Sœurs in, I think it was 1992. And he had said that was the best foreign adaptation of his play ever. And I think part of it is because the Yiddish neighbors on the Main and the French-Canadian neighbors on the Main, they were growing up side by side. And there were a lot of similarities between that working class community and that immigrant community, the idea of minority culture, preserving a minority language that goes beyond political. It's just, we're a culture that exists in this greater mist that people look at and say, oh wow, this resonates with me. This is important for me. So I see it as something that goes beyond the language and something that needs to be preserved because it's our link to the history, it's our link to the literature, it's our link to the songs, but it's also our link looking forward towards creating new culture and just these new fusions of culture that are coming out with the revival of klezmer. And there's a lot of links even just in the music between Quebecois, like playing spoons on your knee. It's amazing how the rhythms are really similar to klezmer. And you just get all these cross-cultural fusions and marriages and relationships that exist that if Yiddish is not preserved, we're going to lose that link and also that future of pushing the culture forward and creating together. So that's why I think it's important.
I feel like the language is almost split in a lot of ways, and not in a bad way, but it's a reflection of how it's evolved in different spheres. We talked about how it's the only place where it's being actively perpetuated and as a regular language of day-to-day use is in the religious community. And in that format, it's largely been removed from a lot of the cultural and literary and musical traditions that it was naturally associated with, around the turn of the century. In the secular community, the track has been largely through those avenues of culture and literature and theater and all those things, whereas the language as an active language isn't really used in the same way. So it's really been perpetuated through those avenues. And that's an important connection, I guess, to my story. I'm probably unique in this group in that I grew up with very little formal Jewish education, no Yiddish education whatsoever. And I think for a lot of times, as much as I was part of the Jewish community, I had difficulty finding inroads or avenues or points of connection that were relevant for me. I didn't go to Jewish day schools. I wasn't very involved in synagogue or any of those other more traditional places where people might connect. I really stumbled upon the theater quite randomly about 5 or 6 years ago when I was doing some outreach for the community.
How did you end up in the theater?
I interviewed Bryna for a study that I was doing, and she told me she thought I was cute, asked me if I could sing and if I wanted to come to theater.
The only problem, she never asked him if he could dance, which
Yeah.
our schools were a little lackluster.
Remains to be seen.
For those of you who don't know, Bryna was the director of Yiddish Theatre for many years and the artistic director at the Siegel Center.
What I think is relevant for me is that Yiddish culture, Yiddish music was, to me, it was an avenue through which I could connect to, it sounds contrived, we've all talked about culture and history, but it was a way of cultural and connection to identity that was comfortable for me, where I wasn't comfortable going through religious avenues or going through some of the other avenues that were made available. It was very, it was non-controversial. It didn't come with a lot of baggage for me. It was, I came to explore it. It was my grandmother's native tongue. My dad, who's here in the room, understands a little bit, but for the most part, I had no, I didn't grow up hearing Yiddish in the home, so I didn't have that type of connection. It wasn't something that was within me in that way. But what's interesting as well is, especially in a lot of Jewish communities today, through through Birthright and a lot of the other community organizations that are now really fostering strong ties and trying to create a level of identity and connection to Israel, which I support and understand, but I think for a lot of people, and I'm not alone, I don't have any strong formal connections to Israel. I don't really have family there. I've been there a couple of times, and I think it's a wonderful country, and I support it, but to wrap up my identity in an Israeli identity or an Israeli national identity, it was always a bit of a problem for me because it didn't quite fit. And I don't think I'm alone in that regard. And I think Yiddish culture and Yiddish music and Yiddish language, that's something that is to a large extent removed from a lot of the sometimes political and other sensitivities that are related to connections to Israel. And I guess for me it was a very comfortable place and avenue to connect.
My connection to Yiddish, or the importance of preservation, is obviously related to my connection, which is my grandparents were both Holocaust survivors, lost families during the war. For me, it's very disturbing that a language that was spoken as a day-to-day language by 11 million people in 1939 today is basically relegated to a fringe Orthodox community. And people hate me talking about it, but I can't entirely separate my commitment from the Holocaust. One of the objective of Hitler was to completely annihilate the Jewish people. But the Jewish people, his Jewish people, were the Yiddish-speaking Jewish people of Eastern and Central Europe. And in a way, yes, there had been 9 million Jews in Europe before the war. 3 million managed to survive, but the destruction was so extensive. For instance, in my grandparents' native Poland, there had been 3.3 million Jews. They murdered 90% of them. After the war, there were 300,000. They weren't going to stay there. What that did, even though there was a Jewish community that survived, but the place where that Yiddish culture, because culture is inherently tied to language, the Yiddish culture that was tied to the Yiddish language couldn't go on living. There wasn't a place where people could live entirely in a productive, diverse, secular Yiddish community anymore. And for me, the entire the complete disappearance of Yiddish as a secular language, and if it disappears as a secular language, even if it remains used in the Hasidic community, we will lose Yiddish as a language of cultural expression. So if Yiddish were to completely disappear as a secular language, then I think it would be the ultimate victor for Hitler. So I think to a certain extent, the battle is still being waged. So what do I do, and what probably distinguishes me is I make a concerted effort. When I was little, it was natural. My grandparents came to North America at a very late age. They never really mastered English. There was Yiddish. They obviously pretty much only spoke at home in the Yiddish. There was Yiddish song. There was, you know, the forward on the table, and they were reading Yiddish books and their Yiddish records. In this day and age, there's no way to have this almost automatic infusion of Yiddish in the next generation, which requires an effort on my part. So I make a concerted effort. I'm not fluent. I speak to my kids in Yiddish. They're actually very proud. They're actually asking the questions I want them to. Daddy, where do you know Yiddish? Daddy, why don't other people speak Yiddish?
What books do you read to them?
I was asked to bring all of them, but what I do is there are a whole host of modern classics. This one was actually written in Yiddish, but a lot that had been translated into Yiddish, which is one of their favorites. And I sing to them lullabies every night for the explicit purpose of seeing this language not disappear. Because what happens if this language disappears? It's two things. One, it will be the ultimate victory for those that sought to annihilate Yiddish culture. And the other thing, and this was more by coincidence, I was reading an article on Scots about a week and a half ago, and I posted it on everybody here's Facebook sites, and on how the last speaker of a certain Scots dialect had died. And they're just two very brief extracts I wanted to read because I think it transcends all cultures and the impacts of their disappearance. It says, "Why mourn the loss of a language? At a banal level, it's a little bit of color in our life. It's a little bit of color in our lives that is gone. Anytime something dies, it's lost. Whether it be languages or species, we lose something. Everything in the world loses something. Diversity surely is a good thing, and we've just lost a bit of it." And then the article goes on to say, "The loss of a language often results in the loss of the stories that were told in that language and in the cultural knowledge they contain, even medical know-how." And that basically sums it up. If Yiddish isn't there, I'm going to lose that very important portal, the ability to connect with my past and understand it, because I will be cut off from the literature and a lot of the uniqueness that the language contained on account of the circumstances in which it evolved. So that's my take.
Looking at the recent revival of Yiddish and of the interest in Yiddish in the academic world and in the musical world and the theater world, that many young people today, I think, end up coming to Yiddish, people who didn't necessarily have a connection, a direct connection with through their parents, who come to it, because they're curious about their grandparents' culture and to connect with what was in the past, but also because it does provide this alternative, and we were talking about this before, to mainstream, the mainstream Jewish world that is the synagogue, that is Israel-focused culture, and I think Yiddish, because it was the language of a people without a country, the language of a people without an army, I think it represents, and it was also a language that for many people in North America, many people who really made an attempt to preserve Yiddish in North America before this revival, did have a strong connection with left-wing values and left-wing politics. And that comes out of the whole Bundes tradition of Yiddish and the labor Zionist even. And I think so many young people who are coming to it today find it's an interesting alternative that jives with their politics, jives with their sense of a better world. And on that note, I mean, today, I think 30 years ago, Yiddish was not being taught in the universities. And today it is taught all over North America in almost every university, and in Israel, as we said.
And in Europe.
And in Europe too, yeah. And well, that's a whole other subject. I mean,
And there's a Japanese Yiddish dictionary.
We just stole that from Samantha. She looked it up.
Yeah.
She got
No,
the
Talk about going to primary sources.
This Japanese scholar he became interested in Yiddish, and he came to New York to study it at the YIVO program, which is a wonderful place to go if anybody ever has the opportunity. The summer program at YIVO to study Yiddish, and he took on this crazy project of writing this Japanese Yiddish dictionary that is like volumes and volumes
It could
long.
be yours for $600.
We want to talk about where we're going, what can be done. I think for all of us, it's a given that there is a need and an interest in preserving the language. And I think we all have different takes on it. And the first thing is, first and foremost, Jasmine Godel. There's Manon Gauthier. She's the CEO of the Siegel Center, which happens to be the home of the Yiddish Theatre, where we all do our productions. In terms of connecting to it, I think one of the things that we've lost is the ability to go and speak to our children and educate them and teach them to be fluent in the language. And I have no illusions about what I'm doing with my kids. I'm not trying to replace English as their mother tongue. I just want them to know it. One of the great things about Montreal, I think we're very blessed here, is we have several cultural institutions that allow us to partake and actually make practical secular use of Yiddish culture. And first and foremost, I think for all of us, is the Yiddish Theatre. It's created a community and lifelong commitment among any of us. And for those who are interested in, first of all, I see there's a whole slew of people here who have acted and have been involved in the Yiddish Theatre. If other people want to get involved, there's a sign-up sheet we'll be taking names after. Other things, for me, it's absolutely essential that we continue to have a day school that teaches Yiddish. And I know that there's been a lot of debate within the BLJPPS system. Why is it still relevant? It's not necessary. We don't need the language anymore. Hebrew's replaced Yiddish. It's like I said earlier, if Yiddish disappears, we're going to lose that practical connection with our past. And I think the side of evil will have won.
So let's all sing together. I think we'll all catch on to the melody.
It's in your handbook at
And
the last page.
The beginning part.
That can express feelings the way Yiddish can. And that's probably because of what you said, that people went through a very difficult life in Europe, and it molded the language. It's such an amazingly emotional way to communicate the feelings, and therefore, I'm sure it's universal. And therefore, it will always live on, as long as Jewish people will live on, and therefore, we should just embrace it in many ways and learn it, because it's so beautiful, and it's called Mameloshen. When I hear Yiddish, it just melts me. And I just want to mention, 2 years ago, there was a festival of Yiddish theater.
Every night you were there.
And every day I spent there, I was in Gan Eden. I was feeling so good, because it is so beautiful.
With your daughter and your wife.
Yeah, I mean, it
And
was...
as you were saying that last thing, I wanted to say, from Dan Moil to God's oil.
Oh, man.
From your mouth to God's ear.
ear.
Verona wanted